really care it's 2 a.m. in the morning. What they care about is predictability. And that's the name of the game. Heroics suddenly no longer matter.
Good afternoon. Today, we're going to be talking about what happens when a company goes global, and most specifically, when IT and security stop becoming a support function and transform into the operating backbone of a global organization. And with me today is Jonathan Santos, Senior Vice President of Information Services, Technology, and Governance at Jackson Square Aviation. And Jonathan has had the opportunity to lead such an international growth expansion endeavor within IT and security, and we're going to be getting into that today. So first of all, welcome, Jonathan, and maybe start out by talking a little bit about Jackson Square.
Thank you, Peter. Jackson Square Aviation is a global leader in commercial aircraft leasing. We have about 334 aircraft, about 280 owned, the rest committed. We have about 63 customers at the time today, and they're spread across 32 different countries. We are valued with the fleet-wise at $13 billion, and our average aircraft is about 5 years old. My role in Jackson Square Aviation is to communicate all of the IT initiatives to our home office and implement, without surprises, these projects globally and have them scale. That's what I do.
Excellent. Well, wow. So given those locations, that's the definition of growing and expanding internationally. So, first of all, congratulations on all the success. Maybe to start out, can you talk a little bit about how some of the expectations of IT have changed as you've expanded globally?
Absolutely. Yeah, so back in 2013 is when we got acquired, and from 2013 to 2016 is when we started expanding as a company. One thing that changed is the compliance. When we were acquired by Mitsubishi, we did fall into the JSOX compliance, very similar to Sarbanes-Oxley for those of you that don't know. We also had multiple time zones all of a sudden. And then as we grew more and more, 2016, we did have the audits, the regulators, and we also have a lot of the security mandates that were unfamiliar to us as a company. We started off as a 10-person private equity owner, and this institute, Mitsubishi, purchased us and gave us all this new compliance standards.
Wow. Okay. So through that growth, as kind of a startup, you really focused on being good enough, having good enough infrastructure, good enough tools and processes. When does that become a roadblock, and how do you overcome that?
That's a great thought process. For me at least, when boards and shareholders, they don't really care it's 2 a.m. in the morning. What they care about is predictability. And that's the name of the game. Heroics suddenly no longer matter. So the good enough topology really changes. Gone are the days where they say, hey, Jonathan, run into the boardroom and fix the telepresence, for instance. They want something more consistent. So when anything breaks, IT suddenly becomes something that people notice. Instead, it's more when anything breaks, it's cause of IT. It's funny, we talk about as simple as the coffee espresso machine, because it has a smart function. It's an IT problem. So the good thing about good enough infrastructure, good enough, it works, but it doesn't scale. And when you're scaling in the growth that Jack Square Aviation has, you start leaning towards the latency issue. For example, we used to have an ERP system called Great Plains, and when we expanded to Dublin, Ireland, a lot of the users there needed to access this ERP system, and latency is considered failure for many of us in IT. Failure in the shareholder level, it's not even outages, it's more friction. When there's friction between departments, whether it's accounting that can't speak to another department to close the books, for instance, that's friction. And that's what we want to stay off. And that's what happens when you have good enough infrastructure. One example that we also were able to show that good enough wasn't good enough was during the pandemic. So our CEO actually asked IT, are we ready to work from home? Or even questions like, can we recover from a bad day? Can we pass an audit? These types of questions, when you have good enough infrastructure, it really doesn't fly. Yeah, and lastly, if your model is, because of good enough, if it's like Peter knows how it works, or Jonathan knows how it works, that's not a security solution. That's a vacation risk nightmare.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So something you brought up, you mentioned that you migrated from Great Plains to another ERP, and that's not uncommon, not so much the technology, but the migrating applications, certainly in a growth mode of an organization. And one of the things that we see a lot of companies struggle with is the accumulation of technical debt. There might be applications, it might be infrastructure. So how do you recommend, especially as you're expanding globally, that that gets reconciled and rationalized?
Another great topic. Technical debt is very, it's a key to expanding. It's not really about old systems. It's about old decisions that no one wants to revisit. I feel it's also, most bad debt isn't really due to bad choices, where a lot of us might think. It's good choices that were never retired. Let me explain. For instance, as we mentioned, we moved from our former ERP to the new one. Unfortunately, we didn't bring any historical data over. And because of that mishap, we had two ERPs rolling at the same time, causing double the management costs, double the licensing. I mean, SQL Server costs is already pretty high. So yeah, you can see that type of debt compounds as you grow. And one thing I also learned is that debt kind of grows linearly, ideally. But when it grows laterally, much like a virus, it's really unmanageable and can really get you. Yeah, so that's kind of what we think.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so you've been at Jackson Square for how long now? Over 10 years, right?
13 years.
13 years. Okay.
Last week.
Okay.
Yeah.
So obviously in the last 13 years, as any 10-year period in technology, a lot changes. But what's changed a ton over the past 13 years has been risk, specifically cybersecurity risks, security risks. So can you talk a little bit about how that has changed? Both in terms of maybe over the past 13 years, but more importantly, as you've expanded internationally, what have you had to really focus on and account for the most?
Yeah, that's so. As we expand globally, you get more locations, right? More locations, more visibility. You get more identities. We have more domains, for instance, in Azure. You have more vendors, you have more work streams, and even, most importantly, more assumptions. I fell victim to that as well. I mean, even something as simple as ordering IT infrastructure and going through customs, drastically different from Singapore and to Dublin. So then you talk about the cyber risk as well, right? We talked about once you go global, you got to think about the single points of failure. We had a recent incident from our servicer, not unrelated to JSA, where they actually, I think the personal mail got hacked, and they sent wires out to another company, and it was a company related to JSA. So there's always a single point of failure, and there's always cyber risk everywhere, regardless of where you are in the world. One thing we also notice is with regards to cyber risk, we do have a business continuity program. And what we found once we went global, it shifts from just IT to organizational. Yeah. All of our business continuity plans work hand in hand with IT processing. So we have a hand in almost every single BCP plan. And at scale, the risk is really the inconsistencies in the processes. And then, lastly, as you expand, these cyber risks, these actors, if you will, it's not about really the hackers more so, it's about complexity. And because complexity is there, it creates gaps. Once you have gaps, you create exposure. Those things we typically experience as we do globally. The one thing I always like to say is, we're not We don't need to be smarter than the hackers or the actors, or they don't even need to be smarter than the business. They just need to find out where our process got created. And that would be a single point of failure can come in.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, this is such a hot topic, obviously across the globe for organizations as they try and protect their infrastructure, protect their data, protect their business. You're really looking at it, and you're in a position where you're having to look at it through two lenses. One is operate it, execute it, make sure that you're protecting your business. I'm sure you're partnering with partner organizations to help facilitate that. But you also have to report to the rest of the executive team and the board. So how do you translate that message in a way, in a nomenclature that the business understands? The business, typically executives and boards understand risk very, very well. So maybe talk a little bit about that, how you've been able to manage both the execution side as well as working with communicating transparently to the executive team and the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And with leadership, they don't want dashboards. They want clarity. And I've learned that the hard way, with scars to prove it. They really want to translate these type of risks to leadership and to the board into kind of business interruptions, if you will. Maybe financial exposure, or more importantly for our home office's reputational impact. My boss used to always say, let's do fewer metrics and better narratives. And by then, again, our job as IT leaders is not to teach cybersecurity. I'm not here to teach the board cybersecurity. We want to simply explain the risk as it's any other risk in any other business decision. And lastly, if you plan on communicating this to leadership and you have a 40-page slide deck, you might not be the right person to explain it yet.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And in my experience in talking with IT executives across a number of organizations and industries, the most successful cybersecurity programs starts at the top. Starts with the executive buy-in, and it sounds like you've been able to successfully get that buy-in and really have that executive team lead by example. And if they lead by example, it's a waterfall effect. Is that what you find?
Absolutely. And we have a process within our JSA leadership where we actually communicate investment committee opportunities, working hand in hand with our home office. Only then when we really delineate and explain the benefits of the said investment to the business.
Okay. So, kind of shifting from cybersecurity over to another area, a little bit risk focused on the business, is compliance. And as organizations grow internationally, requirements change quite a bit. Both domestically as well as in the regions that you're operating in. So can you talk a little bit about how complexity of compliance requirements have changed for you in the operation, and really how you've grown it and matured it?
Absolutely. We came from a 10-person private equity owner up to the JSOCs. So expectations were that we were governable. And one thing I learned is they don't ask if you're governable. They expect it. One thing that we did when we grow is we got more visible to the regulators, the partners, the insurancers, and there was more audits, specifically at our value. One thing we noticed with compliance is the fact that it should be a continuous effort. For compliance, we can't treat that as events. Instead of more of a day-to-day, continuous exercise. We really grew up our company in 2013 when the auditors asked us questions that we really didn't know. So with those expectations, that was expected with the growth and visibility, and that's what we encountered.
Yeah, it's I think it's music to an auditor's ears if they hear you say not an event, but a daily routine. And how do you transition towards that as a company? How do you mature into that mode of making audits not in an event, a point in time that everyone, quite frankly, is not looking forward to or might even be fearful of, to just routine?
That's a great question as well. Peter, let me correct you. It's uneventful. right?
All right.
We always hear, we survive the audit. For us, I think that the key is to make sure it's uneventful. Silence is golden. Over the past decade, working with the internal audits and external audits, we found that, again, it fails when they're treated like events. When it's a one-time thing, hey, look, we have an audit in 3 years, let's not touch it until then. Success in an audit is really, again, making part of a business as usual, a day-to-day activity. One thing we did great with the Corsica help desk team is we created a custom queue specific for audit events, so that when the auditors come the following year or whenever our audit is, we are ready and we have metrics to prove it. As long as, but here's the key, as long as you know who is the owner of each task, good documentation, a good cadence, that's suddenly the panic, if you will, for audits become more affirming.
So those are the essentials: the documentation, the cadence, the working with your partners, whether it's an MSP or another partner, and really setting up a process to have that evidence ready to go. That's really how you've been able to turn it into a routine?
Absolutely. And with cadence specifically, it builds trust, right? And
Okay.
so that's one thing that we wanted to set first. And then obviously the documentation follows. And then just being able to repeat these requests anywhere, globally.
Okay. So, we've been talking a lot about the global expansion, and we've talked about, some of the, IT transitions, some of the cybersecurity. Now we're talking about, governance and compliance. As a leader, you have a lot on your plate, a ton on your plate, and and the business is continuing to grow. So what do you do to balance what you can delegate versus what you really need to own? Can you talk about that a little bit? What, from an operating model standpoint, what do you feel that you can delegate to the team versus own yourself?
Oh, that's a tough one. Let's see. Well, 4 things, I think. One thing you can't really delegate as a leader is direction, right? Maybe even risk appetite. And I think lastly is priorities, business priorities.
Okay.
We can always delegate execution, and that's something that we champion with with MSPs as well, and partners, but we can't delegate accountability. And that's very important, especially as complexity increases globally. You got to remember that clarity kind of empowers teams and partners. And again, my job is not to make decisions faster. It's to make better informed decisions. And I think that's important. One thing that I fell victim to is the old saying, oh, we thought so-and-so had that. We have subsidiaries around the world with Mitsubishi. And I often hear the fact that, hey, we have this software at this place, or a new hire that came from academia says, hey, we have this software, can we get it over here? And I learned that could be a security risk. So owning that and knowing that complexity that can arise, it's important, because sometimes when you implement some of these, we had that in the other company, it's a security risk, and it's also actually can be more harmful than a spam or a virus. Sure,
and I can, you mentioned partners, and obviously, we're partners, together in this journey. But I have to imagine that your ecosystem of partners, vendors, et cetera, has expanded quite a bit, through the past 13 years. There can be, complexity that comes with that. Certainly, finger pointing at times. Other times, just maybe a little bit of lack of clarity. How do you overcome that in terms of making sure that everyone's responsibilities are clear and you can hold the appropriate teams, whether they're internal or partners, accountable?
Yeah, and I think that bleeds into the earlier question. One thing I want to remember is MSPs, partners, and even internal teams, we extend capability for the business. And we act as a team, almost augmented. We always hear, oh, this MSP augments my current team. One thing it doesn't do is own the ownership. So when we coexist effectively, you have to have clear boundaries. You have to have expectations.
Sure.
And you have to set these clear cadences. For me, expectations matter more than contracts, the SLAs, the service delivery model. And more importantly, everybody needs to decide and know who does what. The last thing is if you have an issue and you have like 4 MSPs politely blaming each other, to your point,
Yeah.
that's not an MSP problem, that's a leadership gap. And in fact, I would like to share that. I had this specific issue many moons ago during a Thanksgiving where we blocked out a set of IPs. They were blacklisted and we put them on the non-approved list. And sure enough, a couple years later, Microsoft purchased that block of IPs. Unbeknownst to us, we didn't unblock that, and so many of our Intune's deployment were effectively not working and requiring all our MSPs to kind of finger point. A firewall, or it's a web proxy issue. Anyway, again, that was poor document. That was an undocumented decision. And going back to my previous point, it's important to document these. Yeah, so that was my experience there.
Yeah, so that documentation, I mean, it's not only helping from a compliance and governance perspective, but also just in really driving home that clarity internally and with your partners. So that makes a ton of sense, and I love the line of that you said where. The blame game is not really the partners. It's a leadership gap. So really owning that and making sure that there's crystal clear clarity on who owns what is super important. So we're talking a lot about leadership here as we close out. What do you feel is most important as you've expanded and grown? What are those most important attributes that a leader has to have to grow an organization globally? And what have you seen? I know we've talked a lot recently, and I know you spend a lot of time talking with other peer executives, and are constantly sourcing and looking for lessons learned, and as any good but also trying to solicit and understand what other leaders have learned and maybe misstepped on. So, what are some of the areas where maybe some of those other leaders or that have grown globally have underestimated?
For me, at least, it was the technology cost. We got that down. All IT leaders, we have the technology cost down, and leadership trusts you with the technology cost. For me, what lacked when we grew globally was the coordination cost. A small example was our building move. We had a wonderful building move over in Dublin, Ireland, and we didn't focus much on the coordination costs, more so than the technology costs from IT. So there was a lot of overlap and mishaps there. One thing we also noticed is the coordination costs within Azure. So one thing that I've encountered is, hey, this technology is free. Now that we have Azure, let's get rid of our original point solution. But what I didn't take account for is the coordination cost, the engineering, the adoption, even the support. So I think really it's the coordination cost that really we underestimate as leaders. And when you underestimate some of these coordination costs, it creates gaps, and gaps create exposure.
Yeah.
That's one thing we found and I experienced.
Okay. So, I want to go back to something you said earlier, and I think this comes back to leadership as well. You said that you're in a position where you're not necessarily looking to make decisions faster, but I hear from a lot of leaders that they are looking to make decisions faster and more accurately, right? So, how do you most effectively balance that speed with precision? To not get too over-indexed on precision, but at the same time not be careless and make decisions too quickly.
Absolutely. One thing that we do is we start off with a great RFP, right? And I think maybe I'm wrong here, but if you're referring to kind of point solutions versus operating models, we found out point solutions are fast. They're fast, they're nimble, but they don't scale. And operating models, they're boring, but they do scale. With that being said, it's a consistency of these implementations that really matter. Yeah, it's kind of almost like a pyramid, right? You got the cost and speed and the accuracy, and something's got to give. one thing that we do within our RFP model is to kind of balance and produce these ROIs. And I kind of want to say overestimate the outcome. One thing that we do in Jackson Square Aviation is do a 3 to 5 year plan. It would impact, despite sometimes solutions can be inaccurate, and that might be mildly uncomfortable, but those are usually the right decisions. Take, for example, our new ERP system. We actually did a digital transformation in JSA, and it's increased our closing time.
Time to close your books.
Exactly.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's our goal.
Yeah, that's awesome. What did it increase by?
So, we didn't have a full percentage. We're still in the middle of our DX transformation.
Okay.
But it took out the hesitation, right? We were prone to a lot of manual input, sure. Causing delays in the books. And now we have kind of a system that does it automatically. We're still integrating, albeit, but for the most part, we did decrease our closing time and the hesitation from our users putting these manual inputs in.
Okay. Okay, and that's globally.
That's global. Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent. That's great to hear. So, as leaders, are put in the position, IT leaders specifically are put in the position to expand globally. Their business is expanding into a new region. What should they be thinking about? What's their priority number one, priority number two that they should be thinking about?
This is great because we have a new head of HR, and she asked me a great question that I've been thinking about. If you were to redo this all over again, rebuild your IT in reference to internal expansion in our current enterprise application set, how would you rebuild it? And to answer your question, you really want to design for scale. You want to build boring systems with clear ownership. We found that was key back when I started in 2013. We had a whole bunch of silo systems with independent ownership, and they were almost like different companies not working together. So now we are integrating all our enterprise systems, and we're understanding who's the business owners and who works closely with the system owners. And I think by doing that, you reduce gaps, you reduce hesitation. You also be able to translate risk into clear business languages. I think when you go international expansions, you really don't want to scale technology. Many IT leaders think, hey, we're scaling technology. No, we're actually scaling judgment, discipline, and maybe even clarity.
Okay, excellent. So this wouldn't be an IT podcast if I didn't bring up the topic of AI. And
yes.
And to dovetail it into this conversation of global expansion, I'm sure you're getting a lot of inputs, a lot of requests from the field. And you mentioned offices in Dublin, Singapore, obviously here in the States. How is JSA approaching AI from a technology standpoint, maybe from a governance standpoint? How are you thinking about that?
So as it stands today, our home office has dictated a policy with regards to AI. Back in May, they wanted to make sure that it's not a Wild Wild West scenario.
Yeah.
Since then, we've prohibited the generative AI sites, and we followed the process. So the process is, let's make a policy, let's get that really nailed down, and then communicate that to your user base. Upon doing that, we then insert into our manuals, our IT manuals, and then we do repeatable, recurring training. Within our policy, we then identify each AI enhancement that affects our system. Since then, we've enabled Copilot, Microsoft Copilot, but not yet the other generative AI sites. So right now, we are entering the learning game, much like many other companies. My focus in the next fiscal year is to secure the AI transactions. We are looking in many models. I think we just started our RFP with that. So that's kind of where we are in our AI journey as it stands. As far as technical reasoning of how we use AI for our industry, it's few and far between, but there are a lot of AI embedded within our enterprise applications. So our ERP systems has some AI benefits in there. We have our contract legal possibilities, but it's more discovery at this point in time. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's a very thoughtful and I would say mature approach to AI. You know, we're obviously in a position where we get asked from a lot of our clients and prospects on, you know, where do we start, where do we go with AI, and it really does start with having, you know, a policy in place, some governance in place, and it sounds like JSA has that, which is excellent. So it's not the wild, wild west. And again, as you know, we were talking earlier about balancing that speed with precision. This is another area where companies are going to have to really balance that, you know, speed and innovation without, you know, endangering the business and putting the business at risk. So, so kudos to yourself and the JSA team. So great work there. Well, Jonathan, to close out, first of all, you know, thank you so much for spending the time with us here today in beautiful San Francisco. Appreciate the weather as well. You know, as we close out, is there any advice, parting advice that you would give to an executive as they are, you know, maybe even contemplating that international expansion? You talked about some of those priorities, but maybe even, you know, reflecting on your own journey. You know, if you were sitting down with an executive over a cup of coffee, what would you advise them on?
You almost want to wrap that up in a single sentence, but let's see. Growth is less about shiny new IT systems, right? It's about fewer surprises, I think. The less surprises that we give to our leadership, the better IT is. And I think I said it earlier, science is golden. But as you prepare for global expansion and scale, you know, again, I think there was a couple instances where we want to kind of remember boring systems, being scaled, setting ownership, setting cadences, and having that trust with an MSP is important. As you know, Peter, trust cannot be dictated, it must be earned. And we're fortunate to have Corsica as a trusted partner in our help desk. So as long as you have solid partners, know the boundaries, just understand that scaling systems it's not really as verbatim as it is, and just knowing the risks globally is probably what I would recommend.
Okay. So fewer surprises.
Fewer surprises.
Fewer surprises is the key. That's great. Well, Jonathan, again, thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it, and looking forward to continuing the road ahead.